In the early 1950s, some of the worst events were due to negligence. Plane crashes were all too frequent, hospital and nursing home fires killed hundreds, and nuclear testing created a series of environmental disasters. Starting in 1955, a new set of problems would demand attention. Racism in the United States would finally have its day in court. The UK would hang a woman for the last time. And terrorism was on the menu. Now here are the most horrible events of 1955. Ruth Ellis. Ruth Ellis was born in 1926 and was the fifth of 6 children. Her family moved to London in 1941. At the age of 14, Ruth began working as a waitress. Ruth did not live according to the expectations of society. As a result, her life was full of unique challenges. At the age of 17, she became pregnant by a Canadian soldier. She had a son who was known as Andy. Andy was sent to live with Ruth's mother after a year. Although she was not raising her son, Ruth still needed money. She began nude modeling, which paid better than most other legal opportunities. This eventually allowed her to become a nightclub hostess, which paid yet more. Ruth was an enterprising young woman. Being a nightclub hostess also allowed her to make money on the side as a prostitute. This worked well until 1950, when she became pregnant by a customer. The pregnancy was terminated. Ruth Ellis married shortly thereafter, had another child, then divorced her husband. In 1953, she met David Blakely, who was an alcoholic race car driver. The two moved in together even though they were seeing other people. Their relationship was extremely volatile. David finally offered to marry Ruth in January 1955 when she was pregnant with his child. The marriage never happened because Ruth had a miscarriage a few weeks later when David punched her in the stomach. Despite this, Ruth still did not end her relationship with David Blakely, and David also continued to see other women. Ruth became increasingly unsettled as the next few months passed. On Easter Sunday, Ruth found where David's car was parked. She waited outside until he emerged with a friend. As David walked by, Ruth yelled, "Hey, David," several times. David Blakely ignored her. As David was searching for his car keys, Ruth produced a .38 revolver and began firing at him. The first shot missed, and he started to run around the car. The second round hit David, and he collapsed on the pavement. Ruth then stood over him and fired 3 more shots into his body. The last shot missed David, ricocheted off the road, and injured a bystander. Ruth confessed to the murder and refused to consider pleading insanity. When asked in court whether she intended to kill David, she replied yes. Under the law, a mandatory death sentence was given. On July 13th, Ruth was taken from her cell and hanged. Ruth Ellis was the last woman executed in the UK. As was customary at the time for executed prisoners, she was buried in an unmarked grave. In the early 1970s, attitudes changed. The remains of executed women were exhumed and given proper burials. Ruth was among those who were reburied. She was given a proper tombstone as well. Unfortunately, her son Andy destroyed it in 1982 right before committing suicide. 1955 Le Mans disaster. Driving vehicles at a high rate of speed is a dangerous activity in any time period, but it was especially hazardous in the 1950s. Every year there is a race known as the 24 Hours of Le Mans. The race continues for a full day, with drivers taking shifts on each team. The race is extremely grueling and dangerous. It was far more dangerous before modern safety standards forced changes to the track. In 1955, the track was mostly identical to the layout it had in 1923 when the Le Mans race was established. The top speed of vehicles in the 1920s was around 60 miles per hour. By the mid-1950s, cars on Le Mans were doing around 170 miles per hour. There were no barriers between the track and pit crew, and the only thing separating the vehicles from the crowd was a raised mound of dirt. The cars also didn't have seatbelts. Drivers thought it was better to be thrown clear than trapped in a crushed burning car. The crash that would change racing forever happened at 6:26 p.m. at the end of lap 35. One car cut in front of another, then the driver hit his brakes to make a pit stop. The car that was behind pulled to the left and was hit by a much faster vehicle. The faster vehicle was launched through the air on impact. The driver was thrown onto the track, dead. His car also flew into the spectators and disintegrated. About 78 people died and an additional 178 were injured. It is still the worst disaster in motorsports history. In response, racing was temporarily banned in several European countries. It was lifted for most countries about a year later when additional safety standards went into effect. Emmett Till. Emmett Louis Till was born in Chicago, Illinois in 1941. He was African American, which wasn't normally a problem in Chicago. In August of 1955, Emmett was 14 years old. He traveled to Money, Mississippi to visit relatives. Being unfamiliar with what white people expected of him, it didn't take long for Emmett to get into trouble. He visited a nearby grocery store. Nobody knows for sure what happened next. Emmett spoke to a 21-year-old white woman named Carolyn Bryant. She and her husband owned the store. Emmett Till was accused of whistling at Carolyn in an attempt to flirt with her. Unfortunately for Emmett, he was visiting a place where that offense came with an immediate death sentence. A few nights after the incident, Carolyn's husband Roy and his brother armed themselves and kidnapped Emmett. The two men beat him, then mutilated Emmett, and finally shot him in the head. His body was sunk in the Tallahatchie River. Emmett's corpse was discovered 3 days later, and he was pulled out of the river. Emmett Till's body was returned to Chicago. His mother insisted on having an open casket funeral. She wanted the world to see what was done to her child. In September 1955, Roy Bryant and his brother were found not guilty of kidnapping and killing Emmett Till. The verdict was given by an all-white jury. Since double jeopardy meant that the two could not be tried for the charges a second time, they admitted in an interview in 1956 that they did indeed kill Emmett. Emmett Till's death enraged the African American community. It was one of several events that brought forth the next phase of the civil rights movement. Claudette Clovin. In the southern parts of the United States, segregation was still common in the 1950s. This included public buses. African Americans were expected to give up their seats for white passengers and move to the back of the bus. Most people know about Rosa Parks, who refused to give up her seat and was arrested for it. But the legal battle against segregation actually started 9 months earlier. Claudette Clovin was 15 years old in 1955. On March 2nd, she refused to give up her seat to a white woman. She was arrested for it. Claudette was one of 5 plaintiffs on the court case which challenged bus segregation. On November 13th, the United States Court upheld a district court ruling that said segregation was illegal. The state of Alabama could no longer force minorities to give up their seats, at least legally. Black leaders in Montgomery, Alabama made sure to not publicize Claudette's role in this victory. Shortly after the bus incident, Claudette became pregnant out of wedlock. Civil rights leaders were worried about their public image. Claudette Clovin completely understood why Rosa Parks was a better choice. Claudette said in an interview, "My mother told me to be quiet about what I did. She told me to let Rosa be the one. White people aren't going to bother Rosa. They like her." Kashimir Princess. Although China doesn't recognize Taiwan as a separate nation, it has been ruled independently since the end of the Chinese Civil War in 1949. Sometimes tensions between them become violent. The Kashimir Princess was an aircraft owned by Air India. On April 11, 1955, it was scheduled to carry the Chinese premier from Hong Kong to Indonesia. The Chinese premier claimed to have a medical emergency right before the flight was scheduled to depart. Rather than fly to Indonesia, supposedly he received an appendectomy instead. About 5 hours after leaving Hong Kong, the crew and passengers on the plane heard an explosion. Smoke began entering the cabin from a fire in the right engine. The crew sent a distress signal, but they were unable to control the plane for long. Life jackets were distributed and the emergency doors were opened. The hope was that some would survive after the plane hit the water. The right wing struck the water first, which tore the plane into 3 pieces. The ground engineer, navigator, and first officer escaped and were rescued. The remaining 16 passengers and crew drowned. Investigators believed that a secret agent from Taiwan placed a time bomb on the plane before it left Hong Kong. Some historians have also claimed that the Chinese premier knew of the assassination attempt and, rather than address it, delayed his trip and offered a cover story instead. Destroying the plane did not help relations between Taiwan and China. Intercontinental ballistic missiles. In January of 1955, the United States military announced its intention to develop a way to deliver death anywhere on the planet. They planned to do this by creating intercontinental ballistic missiles, or ICBMs. An ICBM has a minimum range of 3,400 miles. It's mostly intended to deliver nuclear weapons. Conventional explosives as well as chemical and biological agents can be loaded on the platform as well. The US would not be the only country to develop this weapons platform. The Soviet Union got there first, having successful launches in 1957. The same technology was used to launch Sputnik. The United States lagged behind and would not have a successful long-range test until 1958. The earliest versions of the ICBM could not hit small targets. They were mostly intended to destroy cities with nuclear weapons. The first generation of ICBMs were finally retired in the mid-1960s. The development of better rocket engines ultimately provided better alternatives for delivering destruction. Although 1955 was full of depressing stories, it did begin the process of creating the modern morality most of us share today. African Americans challenged racism in court and won, even though they suffered for every victory. Race car drivers also saw their world change after the public became less tolerant of violent crashes. State-sponsored terrorism, unfortunately, has never gone out of fashion. What do you think about the 1950s? Is it a decade full of death and racism? Or is it perhaps not that much different than what we experience today? Please let us know what you think, and if you enjoyed this episode, please like the video and subscribe to our channel if you want more. That way you won't miss future episodes. Thank you for watching Bad Things in History.